High Commissioner for Human Rights, who will deliver the opening statement. Let me also welcome our Mr. Benyam David Mezmur, member of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, Ms. Ana Maria Suarez Franco, Geneva representative of FIAN International, Mr. Giancarlo Siri, director of the Geneva Global Office of the World Food Programme, and Ms. Pasang Dolma Sharpa, Executive Director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Research and Development. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, the list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I would like to encourage all speakers to intervene in an interactive way, present comments and ask questions that reflect the panel discussion. Let me remind you that the speaking time limit is 2 minutes for all. A maximum number of 30 speakers will be accommodated. Those who will not be able to take the floor because of time constraints will be able to upload their statements to the online system to be posted on the extranet. I now have the honor to give the floor to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates and distinguished co-panelists, and it's really important that we have this dialogue here and that interactive dialogue on this important issue of what climate change and how it interacts in particular now with the realization of the right to food. If one looks at our world today, we know that our environment is burning. It's melting, it's flooding, it's depleting, it's drying, it's dying. The predictable, regular swing of the seasons is wildly off course. Cyclones of unprecedented proportions whip up lethal storm surges, a heat wave pulsates across the ocean, threatening marine life, fisheries and coral, and inland seas and lakes, which have nourished generation upon generation of farmers, are turning into dust balls. I saw that earlier this year near the Aral Sea when I visited Uzbekistan. Yet still we are not acting with the urgency and determination that is required. Leaders perform the choreography of deciding to act and promising to act, and then get stuck in the short term. On our current course, the average temperature increase by the end of this century is predicted to be 3 degrees Celsius if nothing changes, and our ecosystems, our air, our food, our water and human life itself would be unrecognizable. Vast territories would disappear under rising oceans or become effectively uninhabitable due to heat and lack of water. Last August, the temperature in Basra, in southern Iraq, rose to 52.6 degrees centigrade. I will be traveling to Iraq later this year in August, in part to highlight the risks of this dystopian future. Our topic this morning is the right to food, and clearly this is comprehensively threatened by climate change. Extreme weather events and both sudden and gradual disasters caused by climate change wipe out crops, herds, fisheries, and entire ecosystems. Their repetition makes it impossible for communities to rebuild and support themselves. Globally, there has been a 134% increase in climate-fueled flood-related disasters between 2000 and 2023. More than 828 million people faced hunger in 2021, and climate change is projected to place up to 80 million more people at risk of hunger by the middle of this century, creating a truly terrifying scale of desperation and need. Already, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, weather extremes related to climate change have damaged the productivity of all agricultural and fishery sectors, with negative consequences for people's food security and livelihoods. Currently, the impact is worst for small-scale farmers and for people in Africa below the Sahara, across Asia, in small island states, and in Central and South America. As global heating accelerates, these repercussions will grow more widespread and more intense. No country will be spared. The worst hit will be people in countries where there is already food insecurity and where protection systems are not sufficiently robust to respond effectively to climate shocks. Often these are countries that benefited little from industrial development and contributed next to nothing to the industrial processes which are killing our environment and violating rights. If this is not a human rights issue, what is? We must not deliver this future of hunger and suffering to our children and their children, and we don't have to. We, the generation with the most powerful technological tools in history, have the capacity to change it. If we put an end to senseless subsidies to the fossil fuel industry and start phasing out of fossil fuels. If we make COP28 the decisive game changer that we so badly need. If courts around the world that are engaged in climate litigation cases hold businesses and governments to account. If we shun the greenwashers and those who cast doubt on evidence and facts out of their own greed. If we rise above the forces of polarization and unify around the imperative of doing the utmost to address climate change and, as a result, fulfill the human rights of all everywhere. If we transform international development and financing institutions into engines of climate action so that the countries and people most affected gain access to climate financing. If measures to uphold good governance are adopted so that when financing becomes available, it brings support and remedy to the most affected people. Then a just transition to a green economy nationally and globally can take place. We can fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals, we can realize our universal right to food, and we can uphold our right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, as was adopted by the General Assembly last year. We can, because there is still time to act, but that time is now. We must not leave this for our children to fix, no matter how inspiring their activism. The people who must act, who have the responsibility to act, are our leaders today. I ask every member of this Council to take this clear message out of the Palais des Nations and into every aspect of our work. Addressing climate change is a human rights issue, and the world demands action now. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the High Commissioner for his statement. Thank you. Before I give the floor to the panelists, I would like to inform that as part of this panel, we will watch a video with testimonies concerning the impacts of climate change on the right to food. Allow me to recall that there is a long-standing practice in this Council concerning the showing of visual materials in plenary debates, whereby any mandate holder, panelist or speaker from the floor intending to display visual materials or images should refer the matter to the Bureau beforehand for its consideration and approval. In line with this practice, the visual materials that will be displayed now were previously submitted to, reviewed and approved by the Bureau.
Soy Roxana Borda, de Quechua, de la región Cusco, de Perú. Vengo a nombre de la Red de Jóvenes Indígenas de Latinoamérica. La problemática que estamos enfrentando a nivel global son las crisis climáticas y cómo ello está impactando en los territorios, en los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales, sobre todo en temas de la pérdida de biodiversidad y cómo está relacionado con la agricultura, con los sistemas alimentarios y también cómo está esto relacionado con temas de la inseguridad alimentaria, la desnutrición, la pobreza. Y así en diferentes contextos se están viendo los impactos que están causando el tema de las mujeres, las juventudes y en la población en conjunto, ¿no? Y más global es como tal la biodiversidad. como un impacto así, como que ya no tiene retroceso, más al contrario tenemos que trabajar para poder contrarrestar los efectos, hacer acciones como tal.
I'm Johnson Jement from indigenous coastal community in South India. Climate change, number of cyclones have been increased. They are not able to catch the fish they used to catch earlier. Fish stocks have been reduced, and also they have to move into more interior waters. Therefore, it affects their income and the consumption of other products for their food consumption. Protection of the key biodiversity areas. So these key biodiversity areas which were protected by over the centuries by the indigenous communities. Now these are damaged or either destroyed, or they are in the phase of extinction. That is again combination of both the industrial activities and also the climate change issues. Therefore, the government should take measures to restore this ecosystem and enable the fishes to have more healthy natural products available in their local areas.
Kopi Bosian. My name is Alice Cipius. I'm a Kadazan from Penampang, Sabah, Malaysia. The climate change has impact a lot on my community, especially in paddy field and also for our fruit trees. So our indigenous community depends a lot on the season, on the weather, for our crop to bear fruits. So now, when the seasons are quite unpredictable, so there are less yield, and now we are facing food shortage. In my recommendation, so yeah, we have to adapt with the situation. So I recommended that we are trying a new technology to adapt with the situation, such as aquaponics. It's a new technology that quite climate resilience, and also we try on the food processing, which is to eliminate waste, eliminate food waste. And the third one will be adapt on regenerative agriculture. So it is for a better soil management for our crops, yes.
I am Farida Ali and I am from Kenya. Northern Kenya is facing a severe and prolonged drought which has affected almost 500,000 people. More than 50% of children under the age of 5 suffer from moderate malnutrition. For girls and young women, this ongoing crisis has increased disruptions in education and increased rates of child early and forced marriage. Women-headed households and young people are disproportionately affected by the consequences of climate change, as they lack resources and adaptability to deal with climate-related obstacles. My community deserves quality, timely, and efficient support, access to food, water, education, stable livelihood, and medical services.
My name is Tor Jakob Solberg. I'm a grain and dairy farmer from Norway and also a farmers union leader. Safe food and safe life is so important together. If we don't manage to have and produce enough food, the world will be an unsafe place. The fight against climate change is our generation's most important fight, and we have to fight together to take care of family farms so they can feed local communities all around the world.
I will now give the floor to the panelists for their initial presentations. I have the honor to give the floor to Mr. Benyam David Mezmour. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Thank you very much, High Commissioner, fellow panelists. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here. The decision by the organizers to listen to a reflection on some of the issues for discussion today from the point of children's rights is highly commendable. After all, a reflection on the right to food in the context of the climate crisis has a child's face. The Committee on the Rights of the Child, during its 93rd session in May 2023, adopted its General Comment number 26 on children's rights and the environment, with a special focus on climate change, which also reflects on some of the points for discussion here today. There is no contesting that the effects of climate change, including water scarcity, food insecurity, are disproportionately borne by children. For this purpose, one can look at the basic data on the topic, which tells a sober story. Recent projections suggest that children born in 2020 will likely endure nearly 3 times the number of droughts and crop failures as their grandparents faced, with children in lower-income countries bearing the burden of the environmental crisis. By 2050, 78 million more people around the world, over half of whom will live in Africa, will face chronic hunger. UNICEF speaks of malnutrition as a triple burden, covering undernutrition, hidden hunger, which refers to the deficiencies of essential vitamins and minerals, as well as overweight. And at least 2 of these are directly linked to the right to food in the context of climate crisis. Let me freeze this general frame for a moment and highlight 5 points. The first is related to the right to food. There is a tendency to portray combating hunger and malnutrition as a moral duty or a policy choice. Such an approach is not wrong, but also masks the important element that addressing hunger and malnutrition is also a legally binding human rights obligation. Article 24 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child enshrines the obligation of states parties to provide adequate and nutritious food. The number of countries that have a law that provides for the right to food is on the rise. Close to 30 countries have constitutionalized the right to food. It is notable that among the 38 countries at the emergency phase of food insecurity in 2022, only Democratic Republic of Congo, Honduras, Kenya, and Niger appear on this list. The obligation to ensure access to the minimum essential food, which is nutritionally adequate and safe, to ensure freedom from hunger to everyone, or to ensure the right of access to facilities, goods, and services on a non-discriminatory manner are non-derogable, including during situations of climate emergency. As climate-induced food insecurity increases, the room for improvement in embracing the child rights framework on the topic is more urgent. The second one is discrimination. Whosoever thought disasters are the greatest equalizers is either not reading or not reading the right sources. Children in general, and certain groups of children in particular, face heightened barriers to the enjoyment of their rights due to multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination in the context of climate change and food insecurity. The impact of environmental harm has a discriminatory effect on certain groups of children, especially indigenous children, children of minority groups, children with disabilities, children living in disaster-prone or climate-vulnerable environments, and girls. For example, as a result of discriminatory laws and social norms, girls often happen to eat last and eat least. They often have less access to secure land tenure, and their farmlands tend to be of inferior quality and more prone to flooding or other climate-related events. Since disaggregated data is a critical element for understanding, preventing, and addressing the rights of the child in the context of food insecurity, it also deserves heightened attention. The third element is the important role that social protection plays. The call for the implementation of the right to social protection through the adoption of social protection floors as basic income security and access to essential services for the whole population remains work in progress, despite its potential to address food insecurity. The fourth point brings me to the issue of violence against children. The climate crisis, which exacerbates food insecurity, can and does cause social collapse in communities and families and aggravates the risk for children to experience violence, abuse, and exploitation. Within the Horn of Africa, for example, women and girls in drought-affected areas have to walk longer distances to access water and other basic resources, such as firewood, leaving them vulnerable to sexual violence. Preventing and addressing violence against children in the context of the food crisis requires multiple, targeted, and rights-based interventions. The fifth and final point is the question of agency. Children are not passive recipients of aid or assistance in respect of the right to food in the context of climate change. For example, the general comment benefited from the contributions of 7,416 children from 103 countries who participated in the first children's consultation, and 8,875 children from 83 countries who participated in the second children's consultation from November 2022 to February 2023. The education system should be empowering children about the impacts of climate change on food security and measures to minimize risks and address challenge. Indeed, if we are serious about accompanying climate change adaptation and mitigation policies by measures addressing the root causes of all forms of hunger and malnutrition and protecting the rights of those most at risk, children's involvement should move from the margins to the mainstream. Almost 35 years into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we should demand no less. In the interest of time, let me stop here. I look forward to the interactive dialogue, which I'm sure will help to build on some of these and other related points. Thank you very much, Vice Chair.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed, and now I have the honor to give the floor to Ms. Ana María Suárez Franco. You have the floor, madam.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. Destacaré algunos impactos reportados por las secciones de FIAN en relación con la calidad, disponibilidad, acceso y sostenibilidad. Seguiré con algunos elementos esenciales sobre la transformación de sistemas alimentarios y terminaré con algunas recomendaciones sobre el informe del secretario general. De acuerdo con el IFPRI, Instituto para la Investigación de Políticas Internacionales de Alimentos, el sistema alimentario industrial contribuye mayoritariamente al cambio climático y a la degradación ambiental. Entre el 21 y el 37% de las emisiones mundiales de gases de efecto invernadero proceden del sistema alimentario. FIAN Indonesia destaca cómo debido al cambio climático el sector agrícola y forestal sufrió pérdidas y daños estimados en 8.800 millones de dólares en 2015, lo que provoca la disminución de los ingresos campesinos. La imprevisibilidad del clima desde 2015 perturba planes de cultivo, provoca alteraciones por plagas y disminuye la calidad de las cosechas. En Zambia, la comunidad namuala se dedica al pastoreo, pesca, caza y agricultura a pequeña escala. Las sequías e inundaciones han afectado los medios de subsistencia de la población por la destrucción de propiedades, cultivos y ganado. La mayoría de los habitantes optan por emigrar. En Honduras, los pescadores y pescadoras artesanales están amenazados por fenómenos climáticos cuya intensidad y frecuencia se asocia a la variabilidad y degradación del clima. No pueden disfrutar a plenitud de su derecho a la alimentación a causa del cambio climático, ya que la escasez de especies marinas les impide obtener una remuneración adecuada por la venta de sus productos o poder ampliar su menú alimentario. La intrusión marina está desplazando la pesca al alterar la salinidad, secar pozos y provocar enfermedades en la población. Sobre la transición de los sistemas alimentarios industriales hacia la agroecología, hay un reconocimiento general entre diversas instituciones de Naciones Unidas sobre la urgencia de transformar los sistemas alimentarios industriales. La agroecología juega un rol esencial en esta transformación y en general para la transición justa. Con base en los análisis de experiencias de transición en diversas regiones que ha hecho FIAN, hemos identificado varios elementos regulatorios y de política pública. Quisiera destacar 10. Incluyen adoptar planes de transición vinculantes previstos de las partidas presupuestales necesarias que incluyan, entre otros, mecanismos de apoyo a las poblaciones rurales y pueblos indígenas en línea con la Declaración de los Pueblos Indígenas, de los Derechos de los Campesinos, la CEDAW y las convenciones de la OIT. Segundo, proveer a los y las productoras campesinas y a pequeña escala con apoyo y servicios de extensión, incluyendo de infraestructura y con la tierra necesaria para practicar la agroecología. Esto puede requerir la implementación de reformas agrarias que respondan a las dinámicas del cambio climático. Tercero, asegurar incentivos y apoyos a productores agroecológicos, incluyendo la pesca artesanal y con un especial énfasis en las mujeres rurales. Cuarto, fomentar el consumo de productos agroecológicos campesinos, por ejemplo, a través de las compras públicas garantizadas en los programas de alimentación escolar. Quinto, asegurar el acceso de las productoras agroecológicas a pequeña escala a mercados con precios justos y con contratos estatales de suministros. Fomentar las universidades campesinas, apoyar mercados locales y economías sociales solidarias, adoptar medidas para impedir la interferencia de la industria en la transición y garantizar la responsabilidad de las empresas que incumplan o interfieran en ella. Revertir políticas estructurales discriminatorias contra la agroecología, como presupuestos, subvenciones, comercio y otras. Y finalmente, en esta enumeración, apoyar y reconocer las innovaciones campesinas y de los pueblos indígenas que son relevantes para garantizar la transición. Finalmente, quisiéramos hacer algunas recomendaciones en relación con el informe del secretario general. Pensamos que, a diferencia de los análisis presentados por los relatores sobre el derecho a la alimentación y el medio ambiente en sus informes sobre sistemas alimentarios, en este informe hay algunas inconsistencias sobre cómo son los sistemas alimentarios los que han causado fuertes impactos de destrucción ecológica, emisión de gases de efecto invernadero, pandemias y explotación laboral. Es necesario diferenciar los diversos sistemas alimentarios para identificar soluciones adecuadas. El informe omite referencias al fracaso del paradigma de la seguridad alimentaria que se basa en el comercio global para la realización del derecho a la alimentación. Tanto el COVID-19 como más de 110 conflictos armados actuales, incluyendo la guerra en Ucrania, han demostrado que los sistemas alimentarios basados en las cadenas de valor globales son muy frágiles. Por tanto, es urgente diseñar e implementar políticas que fortalezcan los mercados locales y regionales, específicamente los campesinos e indígenas. Damos la bienvenida a la inclusión prominente de las declaraciones de Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y los derechos de los campesinos y otras personas que trabajan en áreas rurales. Consideramos que además se deberían añadir la Recomendación General 34 de la CEDAW sobre los derechos de las mujeres rurales, la Observación General 24 del Comité de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales sobre las obligaciones de los estados en cuanto a las actividades empresariales y las recientemente adoptadas directrices de la OIT sobre la promoción del trabajo decente en el sector agroalimentario. Hemos notado un énfasis injustificado en la cumbre de sistemas alimentarios y sus mecanismos de seguimiento. Desafortunadamente, la cumbre ha tenido un desempeño muy pobre en la protección del derecho a la alimentación y en promover un fuerte abordaje de derechos humanos en la transformación de los sistemas alimentarios industriales. Parte clave de esa transformación pasa por la responsabilización jurídica de las empresas y por reducir el poder excesivo que ellas ejercen. Este tema, lamentablemente, ha estado ausente en la cumbre, a pesar de la clara demanda de los movimientos sociales por la soberanía alimentaria. Según las informaciones recibidas por FIAN, la solicitud del relator del derecho a la alimentación y de ciertos estados de incluir el derecho a la alimentación para que guíe las actividades del hub de la cumbre no ha sido adecuadamente atendida. Este informe debería reforzar este pedido con el fin de asegurar la coherencia institucional de todo el sistema de Naciones Unidas con los derechos humanos. Y finalmente, aunque los informes de los relatores especiales sobre el derecho a la alimentación y el medio ambiente son mencionados en el informe, se requiere una consideración más profunda de su rico y substanciado contenido. Hemos sido informadas de que ninguno de los dos relatores ha sido consultado debidamente para este informe, por tanto esperamos que ellos sean involucrados en el seguimiento del mismo. Agradezco su atención y espero poder responder a sus preguntas durante el diálogo interactivo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I have the honor now to give the floor to Mr. Giancarlo Chiri. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Excellencies, esteemed panelists, it's really a pleasure to be here today to contribute to the conversation at such a critical time on such a significant issue. Let me start by stating an evidence that the impacts of climate change are increasing vulnerabilities worldwide. A couple of figures here. 3.6 billion people live in areas that are highly vulnerable to climate extremes, and this accounts for over 40% of the global population. In the past decade, over 80% of all disasters were climate-related, affecting 1.7 billion people globally and costing an average of $150 billion annually. It's quite a sum. The number of extreme weather events, droughts, floods, and storms in developing countries has more than doubled since the early 90s. By 2030, the number of climate-related disasters is projected to rise by 30% to around 560 disasters every year. This is 1.5 disasters per day. The climate change is one of the leading causes of the unprecedented rise in global hunger. And as you know, WFP works to ensure the food security of millions around the world, and right now we are amid a global hunger crisis. Allow me to focus for a while on acute food insecurity worldwide. In 2023, 345 million people are projected to be acutely food insecure across 79 countries with a WFP operational presence. This is an increase of almost 200 million people since 2020. In 2022, WFP and partners reach 158 million people, the largest number assisted in 1 year throughout our 60-year history. But unfortunately, this barely scratches the surface when it comes to meeting the needs of all those experiencing food insecurity globally. Moreover, climate change is limiting access to food, and climate change is also significantly affecting all aspects of our food systems. We've heard about heat waves, flooding, and so on. But as an example, last summer's drought in the Horn of Africa, covering Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia, is directly attributable to climate change, and that caused by 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons. An estimated 43,000 people died in Somalia, and around 6.5 million people are expected to face crisis levels of hunger or worse in 2023 due to a predicted 6 failed rainy seasons. This is all further exacerbated by conflict and instability that not only worsens the hunger crisis but restricts humanitarian access to those most vulnerable. Let me touch on a couple of solutions, because the dystopian future that the Commissioner alluded to is not a necessity, should remain a possibility only. But we have solutions, and we have heard some of them already. On our side, we are promoting anticipatory actions as a critical tool to mitigate climate change impacts on lives and livelihoods. Investing in early warning systems to ensure anticipatory actions can be taken in good time is growing ever more crucial. 1 of 3 people still lack access to early warning systems. Another element, and it was mentioned, is strengthening social protection systems as a pathway to improve food security. Another one that is well known, I guess, from all of you is building resilience. Let me provide an example. It works. In the Sahel, a multi-year investment in integrated resilience programming allowed previously vulnerable communities, approximately 500,000 of them, in Niger to cope without needing assistance during the 2022 food crisis in the country. Let me conclude by our resolve with our partners to step up our action, but the needs are outpacing funding and weather extremes are increasing. Like many partners across the humanitarian system, WFP faces a year like no other. Needs are persistently dire, while the current funding gaps are nearing an overwhelming 60%, the highest ever recorded in our 6-decade history. So, allow me to urge here today all of you to join force. Through international solidarity and cooperation, we can make a substantial difference in alleviating the suffering caused by the impacts of climate change on the full realization of the right to food. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I now have the honor to give the floor to Ms. Pasang Dolma Sherpa. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Rasidile, Namaskar, good morning, everyone. It's my honor to be here among the distinguished speakers and share my own experience working at the local level, national level, and also in the global level in the more than 2 decades already. You have already heard the impacts of climate change from the earlier speakers. We have also experienced the disproportionate impacts of climate change and realize how important it is to address the common but differentiated responsibilities to minimize the adverse impacts of climate change before it becomes too late, to respect our human rights, especially the rights of indigenous peoples, to protect, promote, recognize, and continuation of our knowledge, our spiritual values, cultural practices, and way of living that has been the main foundation for intact of the natural resources, ecosystem, biodiversity, and food security. We are also aware that 6.2% of indigenous peoples' population around the world already contributing for safeguarding more than 80% of the biodiversity. That is already the enough indicators how indigenous peoples have been contributing for climate adaptation, mitigations, and resilience. And also, among indigenous people around the world, more than 70% of indigenous peoples are in Asia, and also more than 74% of indigenous people around the world is still living in the rural area and depending on the natural resources and the ecosystem, and also they have been living with their lands, and that where all the knowledge and values depends on. As you are also aware, the outcome of the 6 assessment reports of the IPCC indicating that how important indigenous people's knowledge, how important it is to respect the rights of indigenous people for adapting the climate change and also dealing with the present crisis. And it's interesting also to come along with the global discourse on the climate change, especially the outcome of the Paris agreements and with the establishment of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. And along with the establishment of the platform with the 3 functions, knowledge, capacity building, climate policy, and action. The struggle of indigenous people in the past more than 2 decades ultimately come to the fact that part of the discussion within the UNCCC, that how important it is to respect indigenous people's knowledge and experiences to deal with the climate crisis. And despite all the coming up indicators or discussions at the global level, However, when you see at the national and community level, the crucial role of indigenous peoples for the climate resilience, not only in my community in Nepal, but also while working very closely with the brothers and sisters from 7 socio-cultural regions around the world, already experiencing our indigenous resilience is every day slowing down. Every day, indigenous peoples and community on the ground experiencing the adverse impacts of climate change and also the resilience dying out and the drivers of the resilience yet not addressed, not even dealt with our relevant laws, policies, programs, neither it become the main agenda of discussion on the climate change and food security. Therefore, it is very important that we need to think about it. We really need to internalize, not only internalize, but also making it realistic on the ground. Allow me some of the experiences on the ground, as already shared by earlier panel speakers, that our traditional food security system, especially potato storage pit called Laptong in mountain regions of Nepal, also called Riki Mikthung, our Sherpa indigenous peoples in the mountains who have been protecting, saving the potatoes and other ground foods, no more working because of the permafrost, because of cooling the temperatures within the field, no more holding the storage of the food system. Every day, now the floods and landslide has not become exceptional stories roaming in the village. The water mills, not only the grinding water mills, traditional water mills, is swept away, but also, the only part of the village is filled with the debris from the landslides and the floods. The spring water is drying out, and due to not timely rain and the timely winter, especially with the snow, the only stable crops in the Himalaya, potatoes or barley, is already badly affected. Therefore, this is some of the only indicators. Therefore, it is very important that we not just talk, but put into action and further paradigm shift from the business as usual model to see from indigenous worldviews, develop our approach, whether in development approach or in education or in climate action. Always important to think from the human rights-based approach to live with respect and dignity. And especially the land tenure security of indigenous peoples is fundamental basis for the human rights of indigenous people, because land is attached not only for the food, but knowledge, value, spiritual connection, and also protection of our knowledge and values, and to be continued by generations. And most important, finally, to emphasize that it is important that science to balance with indigenous knowledge, not just only from top-down approach, not from the horizontal approach or vertical approach, but equal footing basis, side by side, for the sustainability, dealing with the climate crisis and food security, and allow our indigenous young generations in the future to live with respect, dignity, and harmony, in harmony with our communities and in the nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam. Excellencies, colleagues, we will now begin with the first part of the list of speakers. All interventions from the floor are limited to 2 minutes. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Nguyen Minh Vu, the Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam.
Mr. Vice President, against adverse impacts of climate change on the full realization of the right to food that we are witnessing, dialogue and cooperation among all countries and all stakeholders must be enhanced so that the right to food in its accessibility, availability, adequacy, and sustainability can be enjoyed by all. Along that line, my delegation equally believes that those who are more affected should receive more attention and assistance. Mr. Vice President, throughout our millennia-long history, Vietnam has recognized food security as a matter of not only a person's existence, dignity, and human rights, but also social cohesion and development, which laid foundation for the enjoyment of other rights. Recently, Vietnam has managed to ensure the right to food, feeding our population, and at the same time becoming a transparent, responsible, and sustainable food provider at regional and global scale, as committed at the 2021 United Nations Food Systems Summit. From our experiences, transition of food systems can help ensure the right to food against challenges caused by climate change, the disruptions caused by pandemic and other multifaceted global issues. Local and national circumstances must be taken into account, and all relevant stakeholders should be enabled to participate so that the transition of food systems can make full use of innovation and investment to promote inclusiveness and efficiency. We look forward to further cooperation with international partners in this field in particular, and in addressing adverse impact of climate change on human rights in the region in general. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon on behalf of the group of Arab states.
السيد الرئيس، يسرني أن ألقي هذه الكلمة نيابة عن المجموعة العربية. تناقش حلقة النقاش السنوية حول التداعيات السلبية للتغير المناخي هذا العام موضوعا بالغ الأهمية، حيث يتم النظر في التأثيرات الضارة لتغير المناخ على الإعمال الكامل للحق في الغذاء. في البداية تشير المجموعة إلى قرار الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة الذي يقر بالأثر السلبي لتغير المناخ على الأمن الغذائي، وإلى قرار مجلس حقوق الإنسان 37/10 الذي يعتبر بأن تغير المناخ يشكل تهديدا للحق في الغذاء، وتؤكد على أهمية وضع إجراءات عملية على كافة المستويات للحد من الآثار الضارة لتغير المناخ على الأمن الغذائي بشكل عام والنظم الغذائية بشكل خاص، بما يحقق عناصر الحق في الغذاء الأربعة المتمثلة في التوافر وإمكانية الوصول والمقبولية والاستدامة. وفي هذا السياق تدعم المجموعة مبادرة العمل المناخي والتغذية التي تقدمت بها مصر باعتبارها الدولة المستضيفة لقمة المناخ 27 في شرم الشيخ سنة 2022 بالتعاون مع منظمة الصحة العالمية، والتي تهدف إلى بناء أنظمة غذائية ميسورة التكلفة وصحية ومستدامة، وأنظمة غذائية قادرة على مواجهة آثار تغير المناخ. كما تدعو جميع أصحاب المصلحة من حكومات ومنظمات دولية وقطاع خاص ومنظمات المجتمع المدني للمساهمة الفعلية في قمة المناخ 28 التي ستنعقد في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة في نوفمبر القادم، من أجل إيجاد الحلول المناسبة للحد من آثار التغير المناخي على الإعمال الكامل للحق في الغذاء، بما في ذلك تفعيل صندوق التعويضات لتمويل الخسائر والأضرار. ختاما، تدعو المجموعة العربية إلى الاستفادة من المحافل الدولية والإقليمية ذات الصلة لمناقشة قضايا الأمن الغذائي والنظر في علاقة أزمات التنوع البيولوجي بالتغيرات المناخية، وتعزيز التعاون الدولي وتبادل الدروس المستفادة في تعزيز وحماية الحق في الغذاء، ودعم العمل المشترك لتحويل النظم الغذائية بشكل مستدام وموزع بشكل عادل وقادر على الصمود في وجه التغيرات البيئية. شكرا.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Trinidad and Tobago on behalf of the Caribbean community.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the CARICOM group in Geneva. We thank the Secretary General for his report, which highlights several realities that are known all too well in the Caribbean region, including 1, the increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, such as flooding and cyclones, coupled with slow onset challenges like rising sea levels, have a direct impact on food security within our region. And 2, the impact of climate change is felt most intensely by vulnerable regions such as the Caribbean, which are responsible for a minimal percentage of global emissions. The heightened vulnerability of our region to climate shocks, as well as the corresponding impact on climate-sensitive livelihood sectors, such as agriculture and fisheries, means that a multi-sectoral, multi-dimensional approach to the right to food, one that weaves together the threads of trade, environment, social protection, finance, and education, is vital. Such collaboration undoubtedly extends beyond our region. Regional initiatives, such as CARICOM's efforts to reduce food imports by 25% by 2025, for example, can be bolstered through the support of our international partners. In this regard, we reiterate calls for continued technical cooperation and for increased climate financing, particularly for adaptation and for loss and damage, as we pursue food security as a right for all. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Philippines on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, I delivered a statement on behalf of Bangladesh, Vietnam, and my own country, the Philippines, composing the core group on climate change and human rights. We thank the High Commissioner and the distinguished panelists for their remarks. Climate change has caused widespread impacts that directly impinge on the right to food of millions of people in climate-vulnerable areas around the world. The lack of food is literally the most visceral of deprivations that a human being can experience. Hunger dehumanizes and adversely affects one's capacity to realize other rights and lead a life of dignity and security. Ensuring food security and, by extension, ending hunger and all forms of malnutrition is therefore imperative if a society is to have any hopes of thriving to a point where it can afford to take care of other needs. We reiterate our call for scaled-up climate action in line with obligations and commitments under the UNFCCC and its Paris Agreement, guided by the principle of equity and climate justice. We share the scientific community's great concern about missed climate action targets and call for deep, rapid, and sustained mitigation and accelerated adaptation actions. Finally, we urge enhanced collective action to promote resilient and sustainable agriculture, effective technology transfer and capacity building, and gender equality for the progressive realization of the right to food of everyone. This is what is required to free us from the vicious cycle of poverty and inequalities and for us to secure a sustainable future for succeeding generations. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias, vicepresidente. Realizo esta intervención a nombre de 9 países de América Latina, incluyendo el mío, Perú. Los efectos adversos del cambio climático amenazan la productividad y los medios de subsistencia agrícola a nivel mundial. Sin embargo, sabemos que esta amenaza no se distribuye por igual, afectando desproporcionadamente a ciertas regiones como América Latina. Para nuestra región, el cambio climático pone en riesgo el pleno disfrute de derechos como el derecho al agua potable y saneamiento, el derecho a la alimentación y el derecho a un ambiente limpio, saludable y sostenible, particularmente de los pequeños agricultores, pescadores y los pueblos indígenas, especialmente las mujeres y las niñas, y otros grupos en situación de vulnerabilidad que están en riesgo de sufrir inseguridad alimentaria. Por ello, hacemos un llamado para que los estados e instituciones internacionales financieras, en el marco de los acuerdos ambientales multilaterales, protejan los derechos humanos mediante acciones concretas de adaptación al riesgo climático en el ámbito nacional e internacional, incluyendo la implementación de las directrices voluntarias para la progresiva realización del derecho humano a la alimentación, así como la promoción de prácticas de agricultura y pesca sostenibles, siempre con un enfoque interseccional de género, edad y discapacidad que considere factores como la calidad de vivienda e infraestructura comunitaria. Vicepresidente, la ciencia es clara. Si no implementamos cambios estructurales con medidas de mitigación y adaptación a los efectos del cambio climático, habrá 600 millones de personas más que pasarán hambre para el 2080. Evitemos eso con un espíritu solidario, un fuerte compromiso con la protección de los derechos humanos y políticas ecológicamente responsables. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic on behalf of a group of countries.
Señor vicepresidente, Tomando en consideración los efectos adversos del cambio climático en el disfrute del derecho a la alimentación, en nombre de un grupo de países, en particular del Gran Caribe y América Latina, me permito abordar el tema de la proliferación masiva del sargazo, una situación crítica y urgente que afecta el disfrute de los derechos humanos en nuestros países. Cada año, entre abril y agosto, millones de toneladas métricas de esta macroalga inundan las playas del Caribe, obstruyendo los arrecifes de coral, poniendo en peligro los ecosistemas marinos y la sostenibilidad ambiental, así como el bienestar de nuestras comunidades. El cambio climático es una de las principales causas de la propagación de un fenómeno que afecta directa e indirectamente el disfrute de los derechos humanos, incluido el derecho a un medio ambiente limpio, saludable y sostenible. El sargazo también afecta el derecho a la salud. Las toxinas liberadas por su proceso de descomposición causan graves irritaciones en la piel y en las vías respiratorias, poniendo en peligro la salud de quienes dependen del mar para su subsistencia. También afecta gravemente las playas, que son fuente de turismo y empleo para nuestra región. Su aumento excesivo ahuyenta a los turistas, lo que perjudica a los trabajadores de la hostelería y las industrias de servicios relacionadas. El apoyo urgente de la comunidad internacional es crucial para hacer frente a este gran reto. Esto implica la movilización de recursos financieros y técnicos para fortalecer nuestra capacidad de desarrollar estrategias de prevención y mitigación a largo plazo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium on behalf of the states, members and observers of the International Organization of Francophonie.
Monsieur le Vice-président, cette déclaration est prononcée au nom du groupe des pays membres et observateurs de l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie, OIF. Les membres de l'OIF sont gravement préoccupés par les impacts en série du changement climatique sur l'agriculture, la sécurité alimentaire et la nutrition, surtout dans les pays en développement. Les changements climatiques compromettent, à côté d'autres droits de l'homme, la pleine réalisation du droit à l'alimentation et les efforts de réduction de la pauvreté. Dans ce cadre, nous nous félicitons de la mise en place lors de la COP27 du travail conjoint de Sharm el-Sheikh sur la mise en œuvre de l'action climatique dans le domaine de l'agriculture et de la sécurité alimentaire. Les déséquilibres multiformes créés par le changement climatique nécessitent, pour être résolus, une mobilisation soutenue et la plus large possible de la communauté internationale, y compris sur le plan des droits de l'homme. Dans cette optique, la francophonie s'est fixée comme ambition de devenir un laboratoire de coopération en mettant en œuvre des projets innovants et de proximité pour contrer les changements climatiques. L'OIF promeut une approche vertueuse axée sur les synergies positives entre l'agriculture, le climat, l'eau, l'énergie et la biodiversité par son projet Nexus. Nexus contribue au renforcement des capacités des acteurs francophones, mettant en exergue le potentiel des connaissances, bonnes pratiques et éco-innovations frugales de gestion et de valorisation durable des ressources naturelles, pour une agriculture durable adaptée au changement climatique et pour soutenir la sécurité alimentaire dans 20 pays francophones. 4 initiatives régionales sont prioritaires. Sahel, État insulaire en développement, bassin du Congo, bassin du lac Tchad, à travers des actions nationales structurantes à impact rapide. À cet égard, nous aimerions demander aux panélistes quels sont les principes qui ont sous-tendu les approches réussies pour protéger le droit à l'alimentation et promouvoir des systèmes alimentaires plus durables. Je vous remercie.
Thank you.